You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist.
Hi everyone, it's Paige Smathers. Thanks so much for being here. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at positive-nutrition.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, whatever podcast app you use to listen to this podcast. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast. My name is Paige, and I'm your host. And as always, I'm thrilled to have you here, and also thrilled to share this conversation that I had with such a fantastic dietitian named Fiona Sutherland. So Fiona and I, in this podcast episode, we talk about sports nutrition and its intersection with weight neutral care. And I couldn't think of a better person to talk with this about. Fiona is an expert in sports nutrition as well as a really well-respected force to be reckoned with in the health at every size space. You can keep in touch with her at The Mindful Dietitian on Instagram and Facebook. She also has a group, if you're a dietitian, a group called The Mindful Dietitian on Facebook that's really great, and there's lots of good discussion that happens there. So just by way of introduction a bit, Fiona is the director of the Mindful Dietitian in Body Positive Australia and has been practicing for 15 years, primarily in the areas of eating behavior, eating disorders, and body image, sports nutrition, and education and training. She's been integrating the non-diet approach into dietetic practice for over 12 years and is passionate about supporting the health professionals to develop skills in understanding more about the complexities of client presentations and how we can focus on well-being. As an eating disorder specialist, Fiona has a particular interest in binge eating and finding evidence-based, compassionate ways for working with people in diverse bodies. Fiona is also a sports dietitian, working with emerging professional dancers at the Australian Ballet School and host of the Mindful Dietitian podcast. So we talk about this more in the podcast episode, but I wanted to be sure that all of you have a good background in Fiona so that you can kind of follow along and understand where she's coming from in so much of the amazing wisdom she shares in this podcast episode. So I also wanted to mention a couple things just by way of reminder. This podcast episode is the second to last episode I'll be releasing in 2018. I will be releasing another episode next week that I'm really excited about. So plug for that one and keep your eyes out for that one. So during the month of November and December, I will be taking a 2-month break from podcasting. It's been a lot of years of putting out a weekly episode, and so I'm just excited to kind of take some time to have one less thing on my to-do list, and I'm really grateful for all of your patience and kindness towards me as I take that break. Let's see, what else? Also, we have the Nutrition Matters Podcast Facebook community, which, believe it or not, is growing and is supportive and is just a wonderful space. So if you'd like to connect with some people who are similar to you in terms of your journey and in the things that you're grappling with, join us over there. Right now we have, 689 members. So it's a fun space to kind of go and be supported and ask questions and build community. So Nutrition Matters Podcast community on Facebook. So this podcast, you guys will notice that I don't take sponsorships from advertisers. But in lieu of that, I do like to tell you about some things that I'm up to see if anything might be interesting to you or helpful for you. So the latest thing that I've put out there into the world that I'm super proud of and really excited to share is my brand new course called Positive Nutrition 101. This is a 12-lesson course all about nutrition science without the gimmicks. So I co-teach this course with my dear friend Jessie Hoffman, who is really at this point couple weeks away from receiving her PhD in nutritional sciences. And then she'll go on to become a registered dietitian after that. So Jessie and I talk about some of the most important things in the world of nutrition science to understand to help you build a healthy relationship with food. So for those of you who are familiar with the intuitive eating paradigm, this is sort of that last principle of intuitive eating, the gentle nutrition principle, where nutrition can definitely play a role in how we eat and how we choose to eat. But it is really important to do that background work of healing your relationship with food, making peace with it, connecting to your body, and also rejecting diet culture. For a lot of folks, it's really important to do that work before diving into the nutrition stuff. So if you feel ready for the nutrition stuff, if you're looking for a place and a resource to learn about nutrition without all the gimmicks of like, oh, and then this is how you manipulate your body, you found the right place. So Positive Nutrition 101 is what it's called. And the way you can access that is through my website, positive-nutrition.com. And then there's a little tab at the very top left that says Academy. You can click on that tab and you'll find the course. So again, we're really proud of that. We're really excited for those who have joined, and we've gotten really great feedback so far. So check it out, see if it might be a good fit for you. And again, this is sort of me advertising what I put out there because I know all of you are likely pretty interested in these types of things. So I do this instead of, advertising for mattresses or glasses or some meal prep service or something like that. I just figure it's a good way to kind of see if what I do is interesting to the audience that I've built. And if not, that's great too. I'm always just so glad to have you here. All right. I think that's about it. And as always, thanks for your time and for, connecting with me each week. It really is super humbling and grounding and just amazing to me that I'm able to connect with so many of you in this way. It's really incredible to me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity that I have. So hope you have a wonderful day and a great time listening to this podcast episode. And here is Fiona. Well, welcome, Fee, to Nutrition Matters Podcast. So glad you're here.
Paige, what a pleasure it is to be chatting with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me. I know this is a lot of time that I'm asking you to give me today, and I'm just stoked to talk to you about all these things that you're so good at and that I admire about you, and I think will be really interesting for my listeners. So thanks for joining me.
Oh, you're super, super, super welcome. And, as we've spoken about before, giving time to things that we really believe in and are passionate about is really important to me. So it's just an absolute pleasure.
Great. So, Fee, talk a little bit about you and what you do professionally, sort of introduce yourself broadly, and then we'll kind of focus the conversation in on a few interesting topics.
Sure. Sounds good. All right, where shall I start? So I've been a non-diet dietitian for about 20 years now, and more specifically, really diving down into eating disorders and body image and more mindfulness-based practice for about 15 years or so. I guess I started off early in my career dabbling in clinical practice, and discovered pretty early on that was not a good match for me. If I'm going to be blunt, I just hated it. It wasn't my jam at all. I found the kind of lack of contact with my patients and clients. I didn't enjoy that lack of contact at all. I found, dietetic departments were not a good match for me, I guess you would say. And I've learned to really understand what is a good match for me rather than kind of holding myself fully accountable for always needing to shape shift or morph into how I think others expect me to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, I think especially for dietitians and health professionals, and actually probably this is a human thing as well, that we can spend some time, especially during our teenage years or early adult years, shape shifting into what we think we should be. And to be honest with you, Paige, I spent way, way, way too many years doing that as, I guess, an older child and through my teenage years. And in retrospect, I just wish I could go back and speak to myself and say, you're cool just the way you are. You don't need to change to be anybody else, and just embrace the things that you love to do and the things that you're really passionate about, and then actually things will work out. I just wish I could have gone back and said that. So
I relate to that so much.
I'm sure, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners do too, and at the same time, it's probably part of growing up is, our sense of wanting to fit in and not wanting to be rejected or, pushed out of a crowd, whatever that crowd may be. So, and then after some clinical work, I actually moved to Canada for a couple of years and worked in an outdoor education space with underserved youth. And that was an amazing experience. I lived in a teepee and lived in this little small community just outside Calgary, and had a wonderful experience where my I guess my vision of the world really broadened and deepened, especially when it came to understanding the very real lived experiences of other people who didn't have the same privileges as I did. And so my interest, I guess, before that in social justice really kind of flourished. And as I came into direct contact with people who, had different life experiences to myself, especially young people. And I just learned, I guess learned a lot about what it takes to be in a position of leadership and what that actually means, and that you don't always have to be front and center to, engage in leadership. But it was a really amazing opportunity for me to come in contact with my own kind of authenticity, and to just settle into a space where I could just get to know myself a lot more intimately, I suppose. And then I came back to Australia, and I actually had no intentions of going back to dietetics. And with that in mind, I'm always fascinated to think about if we were to do a bit of a quiz 5 years on, or a questionnaire maybe is a better way to say it, 5 years on, and just to see how many dietetic graduates actually are still practicing in dietetics, and how that path has been, because I'm sure I'm not alone in, I almost dropped out during my course. I almost dropped out afterwards. I was very, very disillusioned as a new grad. There was a lot of the course that I felt was not what I thought it was going to be in whatever way, shape, and form. And I did feel very pressured into being a quote unquote certain type of dietitian, presenting myself physically in certain ways, emotionally in certain ways. And I felt very underskilled, to be honest. And so, fast forward to come back to Australia, and I needed a job. And I thought, okay, I can either go and work, say, as a barista, which is a fine career. I've had no issue. I love my barista, and that's a fantastic career choice. And for me at the time, it was not going to pay the bills. Certainly with a university debt. So I actually, kind of long story short, ended up in a really interesting workplace, which actually proved to be the most formative workspace that I could have possibly ended up in, and that was a weight loss clinic. Now, Paige, you and I know each other well enough that you're probably thinking, what? What were you doing there? And what's important for me to let you and your listeners know is, of course, I had no idea that a non-diet approach or intuitive eating or health at every size, that simply, in my world, didn't exist. I didn't know that this even was a thing in the world. And so this was probably about 16 years ago now. And so what happened there was, I thought my role as a dietitian, I was really trained to help people lose weight. And apparently that was all about, quote unquote, getting healthy and, addressing disease risk and et cetera, and all these kind of all these beliefs that we have are associated with making our bodies smaller. And the upside is that I had the incredible privilege of hearing people's stories about the way they felt about their bodies, their relationships with food. And after a number of months, I guess, things were not adding up for me. And I began to feel even more disillusioned. And the error that I made in hindsight was I blamed myself. I thought that I was doing this whole thing wrong, that if only I was a quote unquote better dietitian, that these people not only should and could be losing weight, but they also should be able to keep it off too, because apparently I had the skills and the magic wand to be able to make that happen. So but what was really formative for me was actually people's lived experiences. I was just hearing so much pain and what I now can name as trauma, and just the depth of distress that people had experienced. And I was hearing some real similarities, story after story, person after person, human after human. And that's when I was able to stop blaming myself for long enough, I was actually able to broaden out my lens to realize that actually there was something very wrong with the structures that were in place and the messages, and what we now can name as diet culture was really serving to systematically oppress people, particularly in larger bodies, but actually in a variety of different bodies as well. So I began to, I guess, investigate. I suppose that's typically my method. Is something's not right, so I'll start to investigate. And this was really in the very early days of what we would call Dr. Google now. And so that's not where I went. I went to the bookshop to have a look, and somehow I stumbled across a book called "If Not Dieting, Then What," which is by Dr. Rick Korsman, who is a Melbourne-based doctor. And as somebody who has become a good friend of mine, who wrote one of the very early books on what we now call the non-diet approach. And he spoke about mindful eating. He spoke about appetite cues. He spoke about dieting and diet cycling and all these words that were very, very new to me. And all of a sudden, my world opened, because in his writing, I was seeing my clients' stories and I was putting things together like a big, giant Christmas tree, and feeling, at the same time as feeling hopeful, I felt very angry. I felt very cheated that I had never been exposed to this particular way of helping people pursue well-being or quote unquote health, whatever that, means to someone, in a way that did not involve changing the body. And so I was simultaneously, and you know what, Paige, in some ways I'm still struggling with these as these mixture of feelings comes up. It's like I can feel hope and I can feel grief and I can feel joy and I can feel rage and I can feel compassion and I can feel anger. And oh my Lord, it's just, being an adult is just really hard.
It's a lot.
I know, it's a lot. Every day I find it's a struggle. So kind of that's where my learning really began.
Okay, can I cut in real quick and just highlight something you said? I love when you're describing your story and describing your process of kind of feeling disillusioned and then finding this book that put language to the things that you had observed through sitting with people and listening to people and their stories. I just want to highlight, I think that that's such an important thing. I think that having language to be able to identify something that is just kind of internal, and it's this feeling and it's this like intuition, sense of intuition maybe. I find that when my clients and even myself, like when I find these words or these concepts that I can say, oh, now I know what that is and I can identify what that is, I think that there's such power to that. Obviously, like there's some meaning that kind of gets lost when you translate a feeling into a word, but I think that there's a lot of power there where you can now identify and say, okay, that's diet culture, or that right there, that is trauma, right? So
Mhm.
anyway, that's something that stood out to me so far in your story, is just the power of kind of seeing those concepts on paper and being able to say, ooh, they have that experience too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think for me, what it did was allow me then to connect with community, and really helped me realize that not only was I not the first person to actually think this stuff up, um, but also that there were other people doing this work all over the world. And back then, the community wasn't what it is now, but that I certainly was not alone, and that provided me then with the platform to be able to launch forward into working with people in a way that felt very well suited to me, and felt very compassion based, and authentic to me as well. So that's when I started to I had an opportunity to work in an outpatient eating disorders clinic, and at that time I had never seen anybody with a diagnostic eating disorder. I'd seen plenty of chronic dieters, but never somebody with an eating disorder. And look, in hindsight, I had no idea what I was doing, but I had this, what's it called? Unconscious. How do you say when you don't know what you're doing, but you don't know that you don't know what you're doing? What's that called?
I have no idea.
Yeah. So it was really lucky, because now I feel like I really am aware of when I don't know what I'm doing, and it makes me really nervous.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Are you talking about the Dunning-Kruger effect, where like you
Hmm.
don't know how much you don't know, and then when you learn more,
Yes.
you realize, whoa, everybody who has opinions
Yes.
about this stuff and speaks so definitively about these topics, they don't know anything because there's so many more questions than answers.
Yes, yes, it is part of the Dunning-Kruger effect, definitely. I'm a big fan of that effect. I think there's a lot we can learn
Oh
from
yeah,
it.
it's so interesting.
So interesting. So then I guess I spent, you know, many more years again hearing stories. So I feel like I'm the privileged recipient of, you know, people's stories and experiences, and I am in some ways, without kind of without minimizing the work that I actually do put into my own ongoing training and education. I think, that's really how I would drill down on what I am. Is I'm a listener in so many ways. I'm a person who is being with your experience, and helping, and I'm muddling along, as we all are in life, and just trying to figure this stuff out. So I
Do you think that
think,
that's kind of like a gift that you kind of have just as a human? Just do you feel like that's sort of innate in you, or is that something that you practiced and learned, or what do you think about that?
yeah, it's actually a really good question. I think I have had to practice it. Um, I don't think that this comes naturally to me. I think my natural reflex is fixing, actually, because like most humans, I don't like to see other people in pain. And if I feel like I have something, important to share, then definitely from motivational interviewing, it's called the writing reflex. And I have a very, very strong writing reflex, actually.
Okay.
And in supervision, I need to really keep an eye on that. But it is something that, with continued work and support, I have been able to hold, and in the meantime, being able to really prioritize the experience of the person in front of me, and be with them as they are, finding ways to take really great care of themselves, kind of with my support. So yeah, no. To answer your question, no, it does not come naturally. I've had to work at it.
Okay. So I know you do a lot of work with sports nutrition. I'd love to hear
Mhm.
kind of how you got into that world.
Yeah, so I think I was an athlete myself. I was a competitive gymnast for about 10 years or so, probably seriously for about five. And what I wanted to do actually was be a physiotherapist, or in the States you call it physical therapy. And the reason is because I spent half my freaking life at the physio. And so I guess maybe subconsciously I was thinking this is a way I could recoup all the funds that my parents had really sunk into my own rehabilitation. Oh my goodness, the number of hours I spent there. So that's actually what I wanted to do, but probably similar to other countries, it's very difficult to get into here. And so actually straight out of school, I missed out on getting into physiotherapy. So I did my science degree and then I went into dietetics. And you know what? The universe always has plans. I really believe that. And I wouldn't be where I am now if I hadn't kind of chosen that path. And the truth be told, I wasn't passionate about being a dietitian. I just thought it would be a great second choice.
Okay,
So
interesting. And here you
yeah.
are, rocking the dietetics world.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I'm not a typical foodie. Like I love food, as long as other people cook it for me, but I don't like the worst question you can ask me is what's for dinner? Because I will throw something, and I'm not a violent person. I will throw something and, and do a massive eye roll and and then kind of get on with it. But
I relate to you. And it's so like with the work we do, I mean, we talk about obviously things around nutrition, but we also spend time talking about food quite a bit and hearing people talk about their food. And for me, I feel the same way. It's like, don't make me think about food when I'm not at work. It's a struggle outside of work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, it's interesting because I have particular food preferences, I suppose. Like I'm not a massive lover of seafood or, super, super spicy food. And I like the food. I like the food I like, and I'm happy with that. It's like, I don't know, friendships. I like the friends I like, and I'm happy with that. So yeah, so with my background as an athlete myself, I had always then been really interested in sport and sports nutrition, and so I was so lucky that about the same time as I started working in the eating disorders outpatient program, a good friend of mine was moving overseas with her young family and needed somebody to step in just for a year at a couple of quite big jobs. So one was what's called the Victorian Institute of Sport, which is an elite sporting academy. They have scholarships and programs for I don't know how many sports, like maybe 30 or so, like a lot of different sports. And they kind of host and have programs for hundreds of athletes, hundreds of elite level athletes. So I worked with the gymnastics program there and the women's hockey program there for a number of years, which I absolutely loved. And then also at that same time, this same friend of mine was working for the Australian Ballet. And so I've been with them since. So that's been, I think, maybe 13 years, at least 13 years. What is it, 2018? Oh my gosh, longer. Maybe, oh, do you know what? Maybe I've been there for 15 years now. So I really love working at the ballet. And so what I do is I work mostly with the school. So with students from about age 11 to around 19, and then I act as a consultant to the professional company dancers.
So what do you do with them? I'd love to hear more because there's a local ballet company here in Salt Lake City called Ballet West, and I have had clients through the years who also are a part of that company, and it's an interesting world, the world of ballet in particular.
Oh, it sure is, yeah. It's a really interesting world because there are so many competing pressures, and certainly not just in ballet, but in sport and sports performance in general, I find. But just starting off with ballet and those kind of more performance arts. I mean, it's really interesting because um, some dancers don't like being called an athlete. They and what they do is not a sport. Some of them would say, "I'm a dancer. I dance. That's what I do." And I really respect that. I guess it's like being a cyclist. You might not say, "I'm an athlete." You might say, "I'm a cyclist. That's what I do." And I appreciate that as well. So, but in terms of from a sports nutrition perspective, I definitely regard them through the lens of an athlete,
Right.
because of what their body is really trying to do every day, and the kind of the some of the complexities and dilemmas with working with young dancers is they're really good. Like, they are really incredible performers. So they're at the elite level in Australia, and we have overseas students as well. They're at the top of the game. They are sometimes away from home from quite young. We have a boarding house, and they sometimes are living away from the age of maybe 13, 14. That's really young. And dancing full time, and doing schooling, and going through puberty. So, with all that in
It's a lot.
mind, I know it's so much. My goodness. You could not pay me $1 million to go back and be a teenager again. There's no way.
No, me neither.
Yeah, I
Paid
know,
my
it's just
dues.
I know. So I feel, deeply compassionate for everything that they do have to hold during those years. But so what I really aim to do in our nutrition program is offer opportunities for them to really explore food and eating and their body and body image and interoceptive awareness and all kinds of things in a way that really cultivates curiosity and keeps them connected to their body. Because what I notice is that, and we know this through kind of cognitive development during childhood, and then you overlay nutrition messages on top of that, is the more that children and teens and actually adults all through the lifespan, the more we start to rely on external messages, the more we become disconnected from our internal sense of what feels good for us and what kind of serves us best. And so for athletes, I think there are a lot of dilemmas there in trying to match kind of the science of fueling, as we kind of call it in sports nutrition, and with maybe body pressures as well. So dance is just one example, but honestly, I would extrapolate that out to all athletes I work with. So whether they're a volleyballer or a triathlete or a runner or a swimmer, tennis player, whether you're whichever gender you identify as, it's these complexities are not limited just to the kind of sports or performance arts that we really colloquially see as being most at risk of having disordered eating or body image disturbance or anything that, any kind of difficulties that might arise for us. I see people struggling all across different sports, all across different ages, genders, levels of competition, amateurs right through to professionals. So what I really aim to do in my work, particularly with health professionals, is to help people understand that if we think that certain athletes are somehow immune or they're less at risk, then we're making a big mistake. And we really need to hold the idea that unless proven otherwise, somehow, that we need to see all athletes at being at risk of becoming quite disconnected from their bodies, and that actually dietitians are in an incredible position. We are at the forefront of being able to support the athletes that are in our care, I guess you would say, to really stay connected to their body through really considerate nutrition education and really, really compassionate care and thoughtful ways of working with them, which helps them to be able to not only perform at their best, because that's a shared desire that we all have, but then also, physically, emotionally, to be able to support the folks who we're working with to live in this world feeling connected and feeling like, they are more than an athlete. They are a human being living in this world, and that identity can become a bit of a trap as well.
Yes, that's a big
Yeah.
one. That's a big one with
Mm-hmm.
athletes is that it's such a big part of who they are that it's hard to even imagine any type of identity outside of that, which can have really big food and body image implications.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I actually think, look, through experience, I would actually say that the most risky times for engaging in disordered eating or disordered exercise or some kind of disordered behaviors are either the onset of an injury, the onset of an illness, or the onset of retirement. Because the when an athlete steps away from a very familiar environment and one in which they often have been held up as having as needing to present to the world in a certain way, and that includes physically, because thanks diet culture,
And side
and
note, kind of
also
like what
thanks
you
athlete
said.
culture in lots of ways.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, side note, just like what you were saying you dealt with as a dietitian, similar to what athletes might feel they need to present to the world as well.
Oh, definitely. Yes, definitely. I think we must never underestimate those pressures ever. It's like, I mean, the dietitians who are listening to us now will completely relate to, in social situations, the comments that people make. Oh, aren't you meant to be a dietitian? Or, better not eat this, the dietitian's here, or blah, 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 blah. And this starts when you're a student. And even yesterday when I was talking to this group of dietetic students, they were really upset by it, and they said, what's your advice? And I said, you can't always stop people from saying what they're going to say, but never forget that you can show up in this world as a dietitian in whatever way you please. Don't ever let somebody else's idea of how you should be in this world influence you to shape shift from who you are, because you are not going to be able to offer your best to this world and to the people who you are in service to and with if you're going to shape shift every time somebody demands something of you. You're going
That's
to lose
huge.
yourself.
That's huge. Oh, that is such a big deal. And that's so true for dietitians. That's true for athletes as well. Like you've got to show up to your sport and with your team or with whatever organization, your sport has in itself, but you have to show up there as yourself because
Mm-hmm.
you can't perform, whether that's with sport or with your job, if you're doing anything else but being you.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And at the same time, being able to facilitate those discussions around the very real pressures that both dietitians and athletes experience around, some of the consequences of being yourself, and that you're not going to be able to please everybody. And what does that mean? What does that mean when people feel disappointed, or they feel let down, or they feel um, or they don't like you? Heaven forbid, right?
Yeah.
That somebody doesn't like you,
Ah.
or like your body, or think you're awesome.
But
Um,
don't you think, as a dietitian, and I wonder about your athletes as well, but I know for me, I kind of feel like I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't, body wise,
mm,
right? So it's like I show up in a space and I'm me and I'm trying my best to, not worry about what people might think or, just kind of show up and do my thing and be helpful as I can. But I know that, I mean, people have given me feedback like, um, wow, you're well nourished. And I don't really know exactly what that means, but I've gotten that. And
oh
I've
God.
gotten comments on all different ends of the spectrum, kind of implying I'm too thin, so how would I understand? Or I'm too thick, so I'm obviously not a good dietitian.
Mm,
It's such a tricky thing that for me, I've just kind of realized like it doesn't really matter what my body looks like. It's going to be not right for lots of, again, you can't please everybody. And that's very true
yeah.
with your body as well.
Yeah, that's so true. I think one of the things with athletes that's very real is that, especially at the elite level, is that there is definitely this mentality that um, that they can and should be doing absolutely everything that they can in order to, for example, make a team, or to get on that dais, or to progress to that next level, and that is very, very real. So I am deeply compassionate to the pressures that athletes feel to actually engage in behaviors that are actually very disordered in order to, quote unquote, succeed at their sport. And I think it takes a certain amount of maturity from an athlete to be able to maintain that sense of autonomy, and to gather people around them who can support them to stay connected with what matters most, and to not sacrifice themselves in the process. I think, I consider myself very lucky that I have worked with athletes and with sports where we've been able to really make some great changes from within the sport through advocacy and changing processes and setting up, for example, eating disorder prevention programs that we don't necessarily actually call it that, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
We have open conversations around body image, around what would it feel like if you were starting to experience doubts about your body, or starting to engage in some body comparisons. What would you be noticing about your thinking, about your feeling, about where your eyes are kind of going to, and maybe what you're following on social media, and things like that. So teenagers are tricky to work with, because I think they're tricky to work with anyway. Um,
Yes.
and as you and I said, I mean, with our kids, our group of kids, we're a way off that, and I'm glad I'm personally a way off that. But with the young adult athletes that I work with, and there's a fair few of those as well as some more adult style adults, that the pressure to do whatever it takes means that sometimes athletes are willing to put themselves in situations where they are hurting themselves and can get themselves into a real pickle, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, so I heard a quote recently that what you've just been saying has made me thought of. It's something along the lines of the the first step to justifying violence against someone is to dehumanize them or to turn them
Mm,
into an object. And
mm,
the quote was talking about how we treat each other, but I think that's also so relevant in how we treat ourselves. And an athlete, I think, is very much more at risk, perhaps, than the average person in engaging in that type of thinking, where you turn yourself from this human who's flawed and who's all over the place and all, just messy and imperfect, to no, I'm a machine. I ignore, I feel pain and I do it anyway. And they're
mm.
just particularly at risk for that type of mentality, where then it justifies the violence. And violence toward yourself can look like a lot of different ways. But in context of what we're saying here, what I mean is, depriving yourself of food, or over exercising, or engaging in these disordered behaviors.
Yeah, I completely, completely agree with you. And if you think about it, a lot of the way that athletes are treated is very mechanical in lots of ways.
Oh, yes.
Even, even, and I know that, folks who are doing welfare and psychologists and stuff would, I mean, I think they do an amazing job. I think they absolutely do their best in what can be a fairly difficult culture. So, I remember, okay, I'll just tell a quick story because this is relevant. Years ago, when I first started looking at what at the time was known as the female athlete triad. So, for those listeners who are not aware of this is kind of the interrelationship between three dimensions of health. So, one being eating behavior, or the amount of energy that we take into our body and whether that is enough or not, and the other one is bone health and the other dimension is hormone health, and the interrelated dimensions of these three kind of constructs and how they show up, particularly in female athlete bodies. Now, as kind of research has gone on, we have now extended this understanding to frame this as what's called relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S, or some people call it REDS. And just to kind of reiterate, this is the kind of interrelationship between when we undereat, that it has an impact on our hormone levels and periods, essentially in females, or hormone balance in males, and then bone health, and can lead to bone thinning over time. Now, I tell that in context because 10, 12 years ago, I was giving a talk to a group of elite level coaches at a very prestigious training organization. And there was about 10 of them there, and they were really interested. This was at a time when we weren't really talking about it, and they were seeing all this stuff but weren't too sure what to do. And anyway, so I gave this talk. And at one point I said, what's really important to keep in mind is that nothing is more important than an athlete's health and well-being. And one coach actually put up his hand and said, I beg to differ. A gold medal is more important than an athlete's health and well-being. And I have never forgotten that, because I was silenced. I was floored. I was actually speechless. And I mean, as would be evidenced by our conversation now, Paige, I can talk. I can talk.
You've recovered that ability.
Exactly. Yeah, I can talk. So I was floored. And do you know what? That really demonstrated to me one of the things that really gets in the way. That attitude is exactly what gets in the way of athletes feeling like they have permission to listen to their bodies and to pay attention to their bodies, and to know the difference between discomfort and pain, and to know the difference between to fueling my body for performance and fueling my body to control my weight or to control my body shape or body composition. So that kind of, I went and I then did some work, I guess, some internal work, some self-reflection. And then also, took a much, much deeper dive into, okay, this attitude is a problem. I actually think this is a problem. How can I develop my messages really, really deliberately and really thoughtfully to both athletes, support staff, coaches, families, in a way that provides people with strong foundations about how athletes can both perform well and also not find themselves going down the rabbit hole of diet culture and kind of disordered, the disordered kind of suite of behaviors, I guess you would say. So that's kind of where my work has been, really.
So that is such a tricky balance, because I think when athletes hear, if an athlete is listening right now, I can imagine them thinking like, okay, so I pretty much have to choose between performing at my best, or even in certain sports, maybe, having a certain physique that's part of the sport is your appearance. Mm-hmm. So I either have to choose, what you're saying here of like honoring my body and paying attention to it and connecting to it, or I choose to be really good at my sport. It sounds like that's something you're probably consistently having to sort of discuss and explore and talk about with people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess that's at the root of most of the conversations that I do have with athletes, is navigating this quite complex space. And sometimes, not sometimes, often it really depends on the individual athlete, the sport that they're competing in, and also the group that they're competing with, or the particular team they belong to. Because I work with athletes across a variety of different sports, the culture I find within sports varies absolutely enormously. And sometimes as strange as it sounds, sometimes it's an era. So it could be an era of a certain style of coach which seems to be really dominant within a particular sport over a particular period of time. And then things shift, and the style of coaching which seems to be within a particular sport changes, if that makes sense. And I guess I've been a sports dietitian long enough to have seen a couple of changes, a couple of big kind of cultural changes within a variety of sports, some of which has been really, really, I think, moving in a really great direction where performance kind of capacity or performance potential has been able to be maintained amongst the athletes or amongst a particular team. And yet, health and well-being has really moved up the priority moved up the priority stakes. I mean, just to give you an example, I've worked with teams where I first joined them, weighing and measuring and skin folding was very much, or various forms of measurement, so bod pods and blah blah blah, was very much part of the process. And then over the years, with education and with work, and with discussion and science as well, that we've been able to really move away from those as being primary measures of a body, and more being able to, because of course that's an example of how we can disconnect from our bodies, and our bodies become numbers, a whole bunch of numbers, which makes them much more machine-like than human-like. And I was really noticing that mental health was becoming a real issue. And if I was able to connect with a kind of staff and coaches who were able to be compassionate towards this and able to see the link between mental and emotional health and then sports performance, that we were able to slowly chip away at being able to replace those more number-oriented outcome measures with more human-centered athletes being much more involved in their training, so that they were getting live feedback, and they were getting much more accurate feedback, and being able to work with their bodies rather than against their bodies. Does that kind of make sense?
That makes perfect sense. It sounds like, I mean, what I'm hearing is that you've seen some good changes in the right direction that feel really hopeful for the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly would say that is definitely the case. And I think that the other dilemma that, I don't know whether I'm noticing it more now or whether it's always been there, but this is just kind of at the forefront of my mind right now, is this, and I'm noticing it in the broader culture as well, this kind of this, I wouldn't even call it a dilemma. I don't even know what exactly I would call it. It's like this pursuit of an ideal body, and that is usually very individual for a particular sport. And then at the same time, people being increasingly, and quite rightly, concerned about eating disorders. Um, and then there's, fat phobia that it would be remiss of me not to throw in there as well. There is a very, very, very pertinent, very, what do you call it? It's right there in front of you. Fear of fat in athlete circles, to the point where it is spoken about as being something to be prevented at all costs. And really gets in the way of an athlete's body being able to do what it's got to do, especially, if there's an injury around or there's a change in seasons, on season to off season. So I think, holding these two spaces of there being a pursuit of a certain body or body weight or body composition, and at the same time, an increasing expressed concern about eating disorders. I think for sports dietitians in particular, as well as, ultimately it's the athletes really who are holding all this stuff, but for us, this is really a big job. It's a big task for us to be able to support our athletes and the staff and each other at being able to hold the seriousness of eating disorders along with this, these pursuits of bodies, which can actually really lead to very disordered behaviors, as we've kind of been speaking about. So yeah, it's all a bit tricky.
It is. It's so interesting to hear you talk about all of this, though. I'm really grateful to have you dive so deep into this stuff, because I'm imagining people listening making some connections with the conversations that we have on this podcast to this particular realm of sport and of athletes. And again, like you mentioned in the beginning, there's this whole spectrum from the amateur to the elite athlete and everywhere in between. However you identify, you are still, you mentioned that you still see all these issues in all these different groups of people. And so I'm imagining that, some people, when they hear maybe weight neutrality, or they hear health at every size, or they hear intuitive eating, but they really value this part of their identity of athlete, I could see that kind of being a little bit of cognitive dissonance. Like, how do I honor my body, but how do I excel at my sport? And I love that you're talking about this really important intersection, because you're right. This is very complex and very messy and very difficult to navigate, but it's worth the effort, because it can be helpful for the athlete, obviously in performance, but also long term with mental health and with well-being overall. What else would you add to that, though?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think you've hit on a really great point there, and that's actually a beautiful next kind of topic for us to dive into, really, and that is the intersection of more non-diet principles or intuitive eating principles. And for those who are listening, non-diet approach and intuitive eating are very much the same thing. So it's so when I talk about the non-diet approach, or other people talk about intuitive eating, we're talking about just a slightly different way of approaching principles which sit under health at every size. So, great question. Where do we start? All right. So the first thing is that athletes are actually in an incredible position to be able to potentially stay connected to their bodies, because actually optimal performance demands this of them, for them to stay connected to exactly what their body is needing from them at any one point in time. And at the same time, athletes also are often put in situations where they're being invited or demanded to push beyond what would be an average level of discomfort. So in order to push into a space of pain, then that, as a human, this requires a certain amount of disconnection. So although athletes have a capacity to do intuitive eating really incredibly, in my experience, they are often incredible at it. They also are often in situations where it's very tempting to disconnect because of the culture of push, 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 or more, more, more. So the way I kind of present it to athletes is that first of all, I try to do a little bit of myth busting, so that, for example, intuitive eating is not just eat whatever the hell you want, or actually in some ways it is eat whatever the hell you want, but not in a disengaged way, in a way which honors what my body needs in terms of performance, in terms of hydration, training, recovery. How can I pull together the science of what will help me, or what I think, or what I best guess will help me, for example, recover from my training sessions and prepare me best for competition, or a race, or whatever it is, along with what I know about myself. What do I know about my body, my digestive system, my mental health, my concentration span, my likes, my dislikes, my cultural background. All these things are all really part of the picture of intuitive eating. So intuitive eating really is prioritizing what we know about ourselves and using some of the science of sports nutrition to help that process along. So when it comes to sports performance, we're neither totally just going what the body's asking for, and neither are we ignoring what the body is asking for. And I'll give you an example of that, because some people might be like, what do you mean? So I'll give you an example. So with heavy training sessions, or particularly heavy training sessions, it can really disrupt appetite. And athletes often find that their appetite signals are very dampened, or are very heightened often. So immediately after training, when we've got this like optimum recovery zone, often athletes are like, ugh, I just don't want to eat. I don't really feel like eating. And that's a time when we know from science that where recovery is optimal. And so being able to have those conversations which combine the science with an honoring of the body. So an honoring of the body when I'm not hungry, but that I know that this will serve me best in terms of
Yes.
injury prevention.
Because
Or
sometimes people turn intuitive eating into, well, my body told me, wasn't telling me to eat, so I just didn't eat. But that's not really the whole picture of it. Is
no,
sometimes you have to just use your common sense and or use, good scientific knowledge to be able to navigate how to feed yourself.
yeah, spot on, absolutely. So, and there's a lot of ways that we can use this across different communities, but none so relevant as athletes, because most athletes will be able to really beautifully tell you about appetite, about when they feel most hungry, when they feel least hungry. And I speak about this with athletes a lot, because what we want to do is we want to use those opportunities where appetite is the best to be able to really drill down on what your body not only needs but is asking for and desires as well, in terms of enjoyable food and satisfying food. So we're not just using nutrition science there, we're also using our humanity and our common sense and our sense of being, being social creatures, and that desire and pleasure is such an important part of life, including if you're an athlete as well. You're not non-human.
Yes, that's so important. You are not a machine, even
So
though like maybe I'm wondering what you think about coaches' roles in all of this. I know that can really change the culture of a team or a group of people who are training. What would be your kind of superficial, not superficial, but just quick kind of advice for coaches listening?
yeah, sure. Look, I mean, coaches are very well aware that their position is extremely influential in how athletes are invited to take care of themselves. And my experience is that when coaches are very clear about what is okay and what isn't okay in terms of engaging in certain nutrition practices or certain hydration practices, that athletes really, really deeply pay attention to that. And sometimes, even if athletes are not on a good path and, for example, are cutting out certain foods or cutting out certain food groups in the belief that this will either A, change their body shape, or B, improve performance, or C, all of the above, which is what they're kind of hoping for, that if coaches are very clear about who does what, as in, the sports dietitian or a nutritionist is the person to be seeing about our fueling strategies, not an older athlete, for example, who might be passing on locker room chat
Right,
about tips
right.
and tricks. If a coach can really set good boundaries around that, and show some really awesome leadership around staying connected with the body and being really interested, for example, in mindful eating practice, and how that relates to an athlete and performance, and demonstrates a willingness to be curious about the evolving and changing science and what we understand about actually what helps athletes perform best, not only from a pure training perspective, but then also from a whole health and well-being perspective as well. So coaches who are listening, we sports dietitians, we really admire you and we really need your support to be able to help athletes understand how to best take care of themselves without engaging in all or nothing thinking, or diet culture kind of crap, pretty much. And also, we really understand that you might have been an athlete yourself, and that you may have some wonderful ideas about what it takes to be a successful athlete. So, we really rely on you to be able to hold your own experience about what it takes to be a good athlete with maybe the science that we've learned since you've been an athlete, and also that there's more than one way to be an incredible athlete, and that we just really need your support to send those messages to athletes. So thank you for being awesome.
I love it. I love it. So, Fee, some of my clients are former athletes, and I thought maybe we could take a couple minutes to talk about what that's like when you have been an elite athlete and maybe you developed some disordered eating in the process of your training and in the process of your competition. And then you step away from your sport, but maybe some of that, just that, those eating issues or body image issues linger. Meanwhile, you are dealing with identity issues of, this used to be such an important part of who I am. Who am I without this sport? And then sometimes the eating stuff can get even more disordered due to sort of these identity issues. I'm wondering what you think about that. First of all, do you see that a lot? And also, I'm wondering, what would you say to that person?
Hmm. I guess the first thing I would say, if somebody was to say that to me, I would say thank you so much for sharing your experience, and that is so valid and real. It is so real and also so common. The first thing I would want people to know is that you are not alone by any stretch, and that I hope that that would offer some sense of warmth, that that experience is a really, really common one. And also, the good news is that you can actually relearn some of this stuff, because I think some of the, especially when people have been athletes from a very young age, which is increasingly my experience, is that, the teens and the adults that I'm working with, they have actually been in some system or some program since they were very young. Elite sport, one of my children was kind of talent ID'd. And I was like, he's 6. Like,
Yeah, wow.
what? I'm like, no, no. Like, there was a part of me that was kind of chuffed. I was really proud, really proud. And the other part of me was like, he is really young, and no, I don't want him in this program. And, being treated a certain way and being led to believe that he's something special. He is special because he's a human being. He's not special because he is really, really awesome at kicking a ball. Um, and that if he's any good, he can be good in another couple of years too, when he's a little bit older. That's an aside. That's a parent speaking.
No, that's
I've just been involved in elite sport, and I just know how it can get. So, anyway, so then I would probably say, some of the work that a lot of people find that they have to do is what we call unlearning. And that is, it's like a suitcase. We've got all kinds of stuff in our suitcases that are, attitudes and beliefs and behaviors and memories and experiences, and they're all kind of mushed together in your suitcase. It's kind of one big globby mess type thing. And often people are nodding, going, yep, it feels like a big giant mess, pretty much. So then I'll often continue on and say, might you be interested in, together we could open up the suitcase and take things out, either one by one, or we could take out the whole big globby mess, and we could untangle some things. And together we might be able to explore how these things have come to be, how you've come to feel a certain way, believe a certain thing, how certain behaviors have become so entrenched, how some memories are just so strong that, it's really been formative for, a whole bunch of beliefs and attitudes and behaviors that are still hanging around, even though that experience was 10, 20, 30 or more years ago now. So often I'll approach it like that, is saying, first of all, you're human. Second of all, it's really common. And third of all, if you're interested, we can do this work together, to kind of untangle, unravel, what feels like a big giant mess. We could together, if you're interested, we can try and make some sense of this, because before we can take on some new learning, sometimes we have to do some unlearning, some
Oh,
unraveling.
yeah. So much unlearning.
Mm. Yeah, so that's usually where I would start anyway.
I love that. I wonder, just this identity piece seems to be such a common theme I see. I wonder if current athletes, current elite athletes could really consider who they are outside of their sport. While like do that work proactively, sort of setting them up for when the inevitable happens where they have to scale back for whatever reason, or their lifestyle changes, or they have an injury or whatever it might be. When that happens, kind of having a sense for who you are outside of your sport, I think can be sort of a preventative measure to be taken. What do you think about that though?
I completely agree. So, some of the factors that I observe which contribute towards the development of an athlete identity are things like the personality kind of traits of an athlete, predisposing factors around mental health, and other biological kind of dispositions that are around, the support that an athlete has, and not only the amount of support, but the type of support. It varies depending on sport, on the type of sport. And what I mean by that is, for example, the visibility of your sport. So, are you an elite athlete in a sport which doesn't have great visibility, or has front and center visibility in your city, in your state, in your country, in the world? I think that makes a difference too. Um, I think your role in your sport, like, whether you've been a leader or a captain, or you have been, quote unquote, kind of known in a particular way. So, oh yeah, that's that's Paige. She's the flyer, for example, in cheer. If you're known not only as a cheerleader, but you're also known as a flyer, then that kind of comes with it a certain expectation of ourselves, and then also of others as well. So I think, what I do notice is that, not only is it important to do that work as an athlete, but that there's a lot of, how do I say? So what I notice is that athletes who can navigate even quite sudden changes, for example, an unexpected injury, can be devastating. But, that the being able to navigate something like an injury is going to be, a little easier if you have people around you that can remind you that, you are valued and worthy and capable and welcomed and just innately good and acceptable as you are, even if you are not doing the same as you did before, or even if you are still an athlete but you're actually an injured or a rehabbing athlete. Um, so I
That
think
is
that the
gold right there.
mm,
I just, that's what I just wish every athlete knew that. I wish that they
mhm,
knew everything you just said. I wish that would resonate in their soul, because I think so much of my experience as an athlete, I'll just speak personally, like my experience was the only reason people want to be my friend or hang out with me or talk to me or know me is because of my success in sport. And then when that wasn't part of my life, it was like, whoa, like who am I? Am I worthy? Do I belong? Am I okay? That was such a process for me. Uh,
mhm,
and I never had considered, I mean, my brain just didn't obviously work this way yet, but it was a long process for me to get there with what you just barely said. And I wish someone had told me that as a young athlete.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think it's a really important part of supporting developing humans for a start, and then remembering that athletes are not humans on the inside, they're humans first. So human first, athlete second, not
Mm,
athlete first, human second. um, and I'm not going to make any particular assumptions that it's exactly the same in the States, but I'm sure it is, and elsewhere in the world. But we have a massive sporting culture here, and if you're any good at sport, then you've kind of got it made,
yeah, right.
and I find that deeply sad, which I think is why it really, really, I think when my youngest was, talent ID'd and then asked to go in this kind of special development pathway program, I had such a strong reaction. And my husband was like, what's up? And I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm feeling so oppositional about this, and it's not that I don't want the best for him, because I do. I really, really do. And he is a little boy,
Yeah.
and I don't want him swallowed up into a pathway where he could easily be spat out in 4 or 5 years, or maybe a little longer, and he's left feeling like that was all he was, you know.
Yes.
So I guess, I mean, as you can hear in my voice, I feel very passionate about this. Um, and almost, I feel very, very compassionate towards athletes, and I feel it makes me feel quite angry too at the systems that are in place that spit our athletes out, only to leave them really struggling at the other end, where you, Paige, and I, that's where we see them and we hear the awful stories. I mean,
Absolutely.
we hear their joys and successes too, but we hear
Hmm.
the awful stories too.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's honestly that pain that I sit and listen to is honestly why I wanted to have the conversation. I'm so glad that we were able to dive into maybe preventative measures athletes can take, more awareness around these concepts of these intersections of worthiness with being an athlete, with nutrition and body image. I mean, all of this stuff just totally connects into this space we call sports, and male, female, like whatever gender plus whatever age plus whatever even category of athletics. I think we're all at risk, and I'm hoping that this can be a resource people can share among their friends or family or coaches or other athletes. I just think that this hopefully can be a helpful way to even start a dialogue around these issues. More awareness and more talking and more learning and more evidence-based coaching and practice and engagement with sport, I think would make this world a little bit of a better place.
Oh, definitely. And the good news is it's not going to reduce performance. This
Yeah,
is the thing.
that is the good news.
That is the good news, is I think the hesitations are around, but what does this mean in terms of sporting performance? The good news is we have no evidence that it's going to have a negative effect, and there's plenty of potential that it could actually elevate our athletes and elevate us as a community even further. So, I mean, there's that invitation out there to just kind of go, well, we've kind of got nothing to lose in so many ways.
I love that. That's such a good way to kind of close the conversation. I'm wondering if there's anything you else or anything else you wanted to say, or do you feel like we covered a lot of things here?
We did, yeah, we did. I guess the only other thing I would say is, if you're a health professional, you're a sports dietitian, or you're a coach, working in the sporting sector, then just being aware that any kind of disordered eating behavior can really crop up in any athlete at any time, any gender, any sport. So just being we don't have to be hyper vigilant, but just being aware that these are very serious, and we can do a lot to really help the well-being of all athletes in all bodies.
So don't you have a course about this? Talk about what you offer to help professionals.
I do. Thank you, Paige. That was a lovely invitation for a plug, and I appreciate that. Plug it away. Okay, so a little while ago, literally just a little while ago, I wrote and launched an online course for. I wrote it. I wrote it for dietitians, for all dietitians, not just sports dietitians, but all dietitians. Um, in saying that, I've had trainers, coaches, physical therapists, all different kinds, psychologists, register for it and have said that they're really enjoying it. So, but I just wanted to clarify that in my mind, when I was writing it for the dietitian audience. So what it is there's lots of different modules which takes people through. It's got the title of the course is called Eating Disorders in Sport, and takes people through from the very kind of dry, fairly dull topics of diagnosis.
Nothing's dry with you.
Oh, well, I try to lighten it up as much as I can, but I'm like, oh, just grab a glass of wine if you have to, whatever gets you through.
Get through it.
Yeah, that's right, grind. So taking people through right from the beginning to things like, how would I know if somebody is engaging in these behaviours for performance reasons or for body, body control reasons. Early warning signs. How can I set up a prevention program in my space? What else? Counselling skills. Very practical nutrition intervention strategies, and then exercise as well. So for the nutrition and the exercise sections, our colleague Shane Jeffrey, who is an amazing eating disorder specialist sports dietitian here in Australia, I knew that he was going to be the best person for those topics. So I was like, hey Shane, want to collaborate? He's like, sure. The discussion didn't exactly go like that, but it kind of almost did, really. And so he is incredible, and he is a fountain of knowledge with those particular topics. And yeah, all kinds of different modules. So just broken up into bite-sized pieces that you can do online in your own time. There's a Facebook group as well where I'm doing my first Facebook Live actually tomorrow morning, and then those will continue every couple of weeks where participants can jump on and ask questions. And we have some live workshops happening here in Australia, hosted by Shane and myself. But at this point in time, they're limited to 3 cities in Australia. So sorry, but so that's all available via themindfuldietitian.com.au. So you can just have a little hunt around there, take a look, and that's where you can find it.
Great. Anything else you want the listeners to know about how to find you and your work?
I guess I love playing around on Instagram. My Instagram handle is The Mindful Dietitian. So I have grown to love Instagram so much. I originally poo-pooed it a few years ago.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah. I was a late adopter, I guess, of Instagram, but I love it. Absolutely love it. I am also, the website is themindfuldietitian.com.au. On Twitter, I am Fiona Body Pos Oz, because Body Positive Australia is my other business. It's my kind of clinical private practice type of business. And apart from that, no, that's probably and my podcast as well, which hello, Paige, you have been my guest.
Your podcast is phenomenal, especially it's geared for dietitians, but really anyone can listen. And your discussions are so good. You're such a fabulous interviewer. So I highly recommend the Mindful Dietitian podcast.
Oh, thank you. That's very generous of you. Thank you so much, Paige. I just really appreciate being here.
Well, thank you for joining me. This has been a real pleasure, and I'm so excited to share this with my listeners. I know they'll love it. So thank you again so much.
Okay, talk to you soon. Bye.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.